So, Dr. Emil Øversveen, thanks for joining me today to discuss Marxist theory of alienation. And just to give you as a quick overview of your credentials, Emil is an analyst for Manifest think tank, funded by the Norwegian Labour Movement, formerly at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and has written a number of articles on alienation, including Capitalism and Alienation towards a Marxist theory of alienation for the 21st century, and that was for the European Journal of Social Theory. And I'll put a link to that in the description below. But yeah, just to jump straight in, natural place to start. What is alienation? How do you try and summarize this theory when you're talking to people who might not have heard of it before?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. And first of all, thank you for the invitation as well. I guess you would say that I would start off saying by emphasizing that there is no single theory of alienation, as far as I understand. There are many different sorts of theories of alienation. Some are Marxist and some are non-Marxist. Like Rousseau has his theory of alienation, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, Hegel, of course. But I guess like in contemporary usage, alienation has been particularly associated with the work of Marx and sort of a specific strand within Marxism. And there's lots of different Marxist varieties as well. So I've developed what I take to be like one specific way of understanding Marxist alienation theory that we'll probably get into later on. But like in general, I would say that alienation implies some sort of relationship of separation that is also a relationship to what you're separated from. We are separated from all sort of things. I'm separated from you now geographically. I'm separated from my dog. I'm separated from this and that. But to be alienated, I think it denotes something more than just simply being apart or simply being disconnected from something. I think that alienation implies this sort of a relationship to something that is lost. We're alienated from something that we once had, or something that we are meant to have, but is somehow kept apart from us. So alienation in this sense is like an inherently critical concept, I think, because the concept itself implies that being alienated is this sort of state of discontent. It is a state that we want to remedy somehow. It's a state that is negative for us, that generates psychological or emotional or social consequences that are considered unharmful. And alienation also, the concept itself implies that alienation is something that we should try to overcome.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just to elaborate a little bit, like how important do you think the human nature element is? You said we can be alienated from so many different things, but when I've read it and I tried to explain it in that short video, I kind of focused on how we're alienated from parts of our human nature. We might have lost the ability to connect with certain parts of our human nature. Is that crucial to Marx's view, or have I maybe just read one particular reading of alienation there?
I think it depends on what period in Marx's work you look at. In Marx, the notion of alienation is particularly associated with some manuscripts that he wrote in 1844. Marx spent this year in Paris as a young man. It was probably like the happiest period of his life. He had just been kicked out of Germany for political reasons. He went to Paris, freshly married to his wife Jenny, and he wrote these manuscripts that have later become really famous, even though they weren't published during Marx's lifetime. They were only published like in the 1930s, like several decades, of course, after Marx was dead. But in these works, you really see like this romantic, almost sentimental side of Marx that is missing from his later works, like Capital, for instance, is a lot more technical and dry and rigorous and scientific. Whereas in these early 1844 manuscripts, he is sort of young and philosophical and almost sort of like a poet. And in that work, he focuses on the relationship between alienation and our human nature, or species being, as he would call it. And his point there is that what is bad about capitalism is not simply that it's a system of economic injustice or exploitation. It is also that it alienates us from our human nature. It's somewhat at odds with how we are meant to live. So the implication is that we should try to strive for a more human or more natural social order. Um, Later on, he kind of abandons this idea of the human nature, and that's a grounding for the critique of capitalism. And there's this controversy within this secondary literature on Marx whether or not he indeed has a theory of human nature and a theory of alienation at all. And a lot of very influential later Marxists, most notably Louis Althusser, who was this French structuralist, mostly active in the 1960s and 1970s in France, sort of argued that the theory of alienation should really be considered like youthful embarrassment almost in Marx's works. He wrote that work when he was young and sort of stupid before he had his whole like scientific breakthrough and really developed into the Marx that we know today. And alienation theory should really be discarded as part of Marx's like pre-Marxist period, as it were. And Althusser's chief critique of alienation, why he means that alienation shouldn't be used in a Marxist sense, is precisely because it depends on this notion of a human nature. And Althusser very famously argues that in Marxist, we as Marxists, we don't have this conception of a human nature. We don't suppose that there's anything as like a natural form of social organization. We don't critique capitalism for being unnatural. We critique it for being capitalism, for being a specific historical set of organizing the economy. And we should therefore not critique it on the basis of alienation theory, because alienation theory, as he saw it, sort of inherently depends on this strong notion of the human subject. And what I try to argue for in my work anyway is that we can construct like a theory of alienation that does not depend on this notion of a human nature. I'm not saying that there is no such thing as a human nature. Actually, I think that there is, and I think that there is support in Marx's work as well for speaking of some sort of human nature. But my formulation of alienation theory does not depend on any human nature to actually exist.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into your arguments soon. I really like the idea of him being this like romantic young writer who came up with some naive, perhaps naive kind of analyses of human nature in his youth. He called it like youthful embarrassment for Althusser. God, if my youthful embarrassment could produce theory like that, I would probably be a lot more successful than now. But yeah, I mean, going back to your personal story with alienation, then it's something that you picked up at the end of your PhD. You started getting an interest in this theory at that stage, and then into your postdoctoral work, was it?
Yeah, I suppose that I've read about alienation theory probably in some sort of sociology textbook while I was doing my was first starting out at the university. I didn't really think much of it. So I don't really remember my first exposure to the concept of alienation at all. Like alienation is also this sort of like famous concept that has always entered like everyday language. People often speak of feeling alienated. So um, but it was primarily like at the end of my PhD, this was right before the lockdowns in 2020. I actually had my dissertation and my dissertation party the Friday before Norwegian society shut down. So it's quite a big transition there. And I was reading the Grundrisse, which is a manuscript that Marx wrote in 1857 and 1858 while I was preparing what eventually became the first volume of Capital. And there's this sort of interesting nuance to how Marx has been received, because most of what Marx wrote, he actually never published during his lifetime. That goes for the 1844 manuscripts that I discussed earlier. They were first made available in the 1930s. And the Grundrisse was first widely read in the 60s and 70s. So 1960s and 1970s, that is. So long after like the sort of like the scholarly reception of Marx has sort of solidified and set. And what I discovered in the Grundrisse was this alternate theory of alienation that didn't really that wasn't really too similar to sort of the received wisdom of how Marx conceives alienation. And I'd also read Althusser before that and sort of agreed with Althusser, like that the manuscripts from 1844 were weak. The theory of human nature that is found in those manuscripts is suspect and should probably be left outside. And I'd sort of like also disavowed the concept of alienation because of it. But reading the Grundrisse, I was really struck by, like, here was this formulation of alienation that was much more scientifically sophisticated, I found, and also a lot easier to incorporate into Marx's critique of the political economy from his mature works, and particularly from the first volume of Capital. So, and I suppose that also, I started writing this just before lockdown, so I suppose also lockdown had some sort of effect on me, sitting alone in my apartment, cut off from everything, doing this piece of on alienation. So it sort of worked out nicely in that sense as well.
Yeah, do you think like because you start your article by describing how alienation was for a long time kind of neglected and now it's been sort of revived. So do you think
Yeah.
a lot of like scholars have had sort of encounters with alienation that mirror yours? Like they might have initially encountered it and maybe thought that it wasn't too important as an aspect, quite a flawed aspect, but now, like you say, it's coming back into popularity among a lot of
Mhm.
scholars, right? And I think, I guess this takes me to my next question as well, so I might add that on at the end, which is why you think it's still important today, and what kind of issues like the lockdown, for example,
Mhm.
highlight the ongoing importance of alienation.
Yeah, sure. I just briefly touched on your first question. Because I am a sociologist, so I'm trained within theoretical sociology, and in sociology, almost every mention of Marx's theory of alienation is made exclusively with reference to the 1844 manuscripts. So that was something that I tried to do, was try to show that, and there's often also stated that Marx really did not write on alienation after these manuscripts had come out, which is sort of, again, Althusser keeps coming up. It's probably going to keep coming up during this conversation because it's so important for how Marx's theory of alienation has been understood. But Althusser assumed that Marx did not really write about alienation at all after like the early 1840s, and that sort of became like the scholarly received wisdom, meaning that the Grundrisse and the description of alienation, they were largely ignored. So part of my project was to show that there is indeed this sort of theory of alienation in Marx's later work. It was not simply just a youthful concept that he abandoned once he got old and wizened, but it runs through his scholarship and his production as a whole. And I think that within the Marxist secondary literature, at least, people mostly concentrate on the Grundrisse and the manuscripts from the 1860s when they are describing alienation now, which I think is based on a recognition that it is a bit more sophisticated, a bit more Marxist notion. As for why alienation is still important today, I think it's fair to describe contemporary society as characterized by this feeling of disconnect, I'd say. I think that many people experience this sort of distance between themselves and their social order. They feel maybe that they live in a society that they cannot understand, that they cannot control, that is somewhat threatening towards them. And I think that there has arisen, at least during my lifetime, more and more. I was born in 1990, but from like the financial crisis in 2008 and up to the present day, there's been this increasing schism, I would say, or problem between the individuals and the social, in which the society itself has sort of become this problem that we're trying to deal with. And my impression, at least if we look at like a number of contemporary trends, like in the economy, in culture, in politics, we can see these signs of disintegration of society sort of fragmenting and crumbling in and of itself. You have extreme economic inequalities, you have social polarization, you have political extremism, you have the weather that is becoming more unstable and more chaotic. You have all these sort of mental health issues, rises in anxiety, depression, loneliness. all pointing to what I perceive, at least, as like this deep crisis within the social order itself. And a lot of the political projects, particularly on the right, perhaps, are often couched in this language of taking back control, right? I think that was
Mm,
one of the slogans of Trump and of Brexit as well. There's this notion that society has gotten out of hand, we have lost control, and what is important now is that we regain control over this sort of runaway world. And that is sort of an indication of alienation in a very classical sense, I would say. You're feeling apart from something that you feel that you should be, or you're feeling distance from something that you feel that you should be a part of, that should be yours, and you're struggling to sort of get your hands back on it. And what I find also paradoxical is that all this is happening in a time in which we are, objectively speaking, more powerful and connected than we've ever been before. You know, particularly since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right, in the early 90s, you have there's been emerged this global economy in which virtually everybody who's alive today are cooperating through this large economy. They are dependent on this large economy in order to subsist. This world market, right, involving billions and billions of people, all cooperating in order to produce the things that we need in order to survive and live our daily lives. And in this global economy, we also have an immense technological and productive power to shape sort of the material conditions of our world. We have never been as powerful, objectively speaking, when it comes to choosing how we want to live, choosing how to organize ourselves. We have communication technologies that enable forms of cooperation that would simply been impossible. Forget like 100 years ago, like even 20 or 30 years ago, you couldn't imagine this type of interconnectedness. So there's this apparent paradox here, I find that it seems like as we're growing more integrated and more connected, we are also growing further apart and we feel isolated. And I think that what Marx's theory of alienation in particular is good at explaining is that paradox, how we get this breakdown in collective action in which we are really unable to control societies at a time when we should, objectively speaking, have ample opportunities to do so.
yeah, definitely. It kind of feels kind of unnervingly like there's a whole host of these processes happening right now that together in isolation would have maybe revived interest in alienation, but together are really thrusting it back into the
Mhm.
foreground because you talk there not just about these kind of paradoxes of how we're more connected yet more kind of disconnected, but also like the pace of change and something that we talked about before I started recording, given your work is at the moment is funded by, the labor movement in Norway and how that has been kind of eroded in many countries, the kind of social fabric for a lot of communities, right? There's not that much infrastructure to keep people connected anymore, and that feels like its own story, let alone all the stuff around climate and technological change and various other social processes. We've lost a lot of that social fabric that just keeps us kind of structured in a way, on our daily lives that are connected to each other. Um, yeah, it's not a very cheery subject, but I guess maybe the more optimistic way of moving the conversation on would be to get into the analysis then, because that might be
Mhm.
where we can sort of demystify some of
Sure.
this and
Yeah.
pull out like where Marx can help us. And I think that's where we might get into the roots of your work in a bit more depth. And it'd be great if you could. Tell us a bit more about how you connect alienation to social class, because I know that in your article, you know, you have this argument about how alienation can help us avoid the economism usually associated with analyses of social class. Like it's quite reductive. It just talks about economic categories. So it'd be great if you could tell us about that and how alienation can be brought in to help us overcome maybe that problematic tendency in class analysis.
Sure. So economism is really one of the main criticism that is directed towards Marxist work and Marxism as a theoretical tradition as a whole, really, from particularly from the sociological perspective. And the typical critique is that Marx is only concerned about economic factors. He tends to view other social phenomena like social norms, values, culture, politics as just reflections of the economy. You have this distinction between the base and the superstructure, right? That is often invoked in that context, in which the argument is that Marx was only concerned about the economic base and is sort of everything, all the rest of society as just this passive reflection of the economy. And of course, this is very, very problematic and reductionist because society, social life is much more complex than that we know. And there's also running parallel to this criticism of Marx for economism is another ism term, which is the term of class reductionism. That is that Marx sought to reduce everything to social class. He didn't have time for any other inequalities, be they pertaining to gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation and so on. He just saw capitalism as a class society and a conceived society in terms of, or class society in terms of like who is rich and who is poor, right? Class is like a simple determinant of the distribution of wealth and income, basically. So that is sort of like the standard sociological critique. And my attempt is to show that if we bring this theory of alienation into our understanding of Marx, we can really see how a lot of this criticism of economism is quite misguided, I find. So my point is for the notion of class, for instance, like the economist's understanding of class would be to view class as simply like an economic category, as you said. It's an index of how much you earn, basically, how much money you have. Or it's sort of like a synonym for the poor and the medium poor and the medium poor and those sort of in the middle, and then they have the rich and the ultra rich and so on. So it's simply class is simply like a synonym for wealth. And what I think that the theory of alienation points out is that the working class, in the Marxist sense, is not simply economically disadvantaged in that narrow sense. They are also disadvantaged in the sense of being alienated from the societies in which they live. They are divorced from the control that it would be necessary for them to meaningfully choose how society should be organized, to choose how their material surroundings should be implemented and planned, to choose how they should work and who they want to work with. Instead, under capitalism, those decisions about the economy are concentrated in the capital class because they, by virtue of their control over the means of production, that is the resources that is necessary in order to produce anything at all, also gain the social power to decide how the means of production are used. So the working class is not simply dispossessed or exploited like in the economic sense, they are also alienated because they are excluded from these processes of economic decision making. That is really the monopoly of the capitalist class. And if we see the working class in this way as both alienated and exploited, or both exploited and alienated rather, we are able to avoid this economist reading, I think, and sort of can also integrate more psychological, cultural issues sort of right into the class understanding as such. So we don't have to like expand the class theory by adding on these cultural factors, but it sort of follows naturally from how class is perceived.
Yeah, like some of the maybe practical implications of these views of class. Like if
Yeah.
like say Leclau and Mouffe, right? They I think would be categorized as maybe
Sure.
post-Marxist and say that we should maybe the practical implications of moving beyond that kind of economism would be to make these alliances based on identity.
Mm.
Um, if I'm wondering how that like fits in with your arguments. If you think about alienation as this form of exclusion, is there a way, therefore, to maybe try and you unify people around this experience?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. That's an interesting point. As for La Clown move, I would say that it's sort of, I don't know if you have this expression in English, but in Norwegian we say that you're kicking in an open door, like it's a door that's already open and you're still kicking it in, because Marxists have always historically allied themselves with the women's movement, for instance, or sort of like anti-colonial movements, movements for immigrants. So that is sort of nothing new. But what I've been concerned with is more about creating a sort of unity within the working class, because the critique that you often get, or the practical difficulty that you often meet when you're trying to organize, is that the economic interest of the working class, like narrowly speaking, is not always as homogeneous as Marxists would assume. Because like the traditional Marxist view is that the working class have nothing to lose but their chains, they are disadvantaged, they are poor, so they have everything to gain by this sort of economic redistribution. But like in modern class structures, you see that it's much more complex than that. You have several different strata of workers, and some are quite economically privileged, and some are very no privileged. And there's particularly this issue of the relationship like between the working class in the global north and the global south, for instance. Like the global north are generally much more well off than the working class in the global south, and it can be difficult to see how you could uh, organize a political project, an economic project that is in both their self-interest, because the working class in the north has more to lose, so they may perceive it than the more disadvantaged global populations. So what is helpful about alienation in that sense, I think, is that I believe that even in addition to these economic interests that are more directly material in nature, I think that all members of the working class and all members of society really has this interest in having the how to say it, the power to influence the society in which they live. They have an interest in having a democratic say in what sort of goods are produced, what sort of technologies are put to use, what sort of energy do we use to run our economy? Should we use fossil fuels or sustainable energy, for instance? Should we grow the economy? Should we stabilize it? How much growth shall we have? So there's a lot of like very important decisions about the economy, and also by extension for society as a whole, because we are dependent on the economy in order to survive, that is simply outside the scope of democratic politics because of the way that capitalism is organized, right? And ending alienation would really mean ending the separation between like the political and economic, and bringing these sort of economic issues into like the area of politics and make them democratic questions. And that, I think, is a universally shared interest among the working class, no matter how much you earn or how wealthy you are. Even if you earn like a million pounds a year, you still have an interest in being able to influence the world around you in a democratic manner with your colleagues and your neighbors and your friends and all the rest of it. So that is a way that you can broaden this class coalition, I think.
Yeah, and like if you were talking to directly to workers about how they're alienated, would you talk through that process, like in the everyday experience of how exclusion alienation as exclusion can take place? Do you because you had some really good concrete examples there of why it's in everyone's interest to participate in a more democratic process for deciding on things that are kind of excluded from the democratic debate. But I guess in terms of explaining, this is what is going on in in the society we have right now. As a worker, you are excluded in this way from. Do you kind of talk through the process of alienation, or is that a bit abstract, maybe?
Well, I do often talk to workers, that's part of my position, that I do these seminars and courses and talks. I typically don't use a lot of Marxist theory like explicitly when I'm talking to them. I don't typically start with, okay, a mode of production, it's the relationship between the productive forces and the relations of production and value and use value and all that sort of stuff. But uh, uh, not because I don't think that they would be able to understand it. In fact, there is a lot of like Marxist reading groups in the labor union movement, as it's particularly here in Oslo, which is the capital in Oslo, in Norway, where I live. There are some study groups that are organized by the unions themselves that do read Capital and Marxist other works. but also because I find that it could be more effective to really get to the core of their experience. One debate that is very central in the Norwegian labor movement as of right now is the question of how we should organize our market for electricity. If it should be under public control, basically, if we should be able to decide what do we want to use the power, the electricity that we generate on, should we be able to prioritize certain industries above others? Should we prioritize the establishment of a green industry, for instance, rather than Bitcoin mining and data mining centers and call centers and stuff like that? And where there's this very obvious conflict between at least some within the labor movements, quite a strong movement, who are arguing for more democratic control over the power, over the infrastructure, basic infrastructure of energy, as opposed to the political right in Norway, who are much more market oriented and want to integrate ourselves into the European market, and essentially means that we lose the ability to politically control our energy system. So that I would say is like a very clear example of alienation in practice, right? Or alienation being fought through in practical class struggle. But I don't know always if I'm talking about that, if it's so helpful to, and this is what Marx wrote in 1857, and just open up this dusty textbook. But it's helpful for me at least in finding out how to analyze and also finding out how to broach the issue and perhaps try to influence the political discussion in that way.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple of comments that were under the alienation video that I wanted to address. I mean, one of them we've already kind of touched on because it was about why alienation was picked up, because it wasn't published in Marx's lifetime, as you described. Like some of the discussions around it, like you said before, weren't published until the 1960s. So why do you think it was picked up and has become so significant and enduring since?
Well, it's a concrete intellectual history that's quite interesting, actually. It concerns the relationship between like the Eastern Marxism that was associated with the Soviet Union and sort of like the official communist movement, and what is just known as Western Marxism, which is more Western European, it's more philosophical, it's associated with like the Frankfurt School, like people like Adorno and Marcuse and Horkheimer and those sort of figures. And by the 1920s and 1930s, the official Marxism has sort of, under Stalin in particular, been highly ossified into this quite rigid scientific doctrine that you had this twin phrases of historical materialism and dialectical materialism that were sort of enshrined. Stalin wrote a book on that in the 1930s, I think, as part of his short course on the history of the Bolshevik Party. And that was sort of like the established dogma. And it was really impossible to challenge that received wisdom about Marx, particularly within like the communist movements, even in the communist parties like in France or in Italy, or that were not directly under like the political influence of the Soviet Union, but they were still in practice subordinated to it. So when the manuscripts were published in the 1830s, they really 1930s, they really revealed this other Marx than the figure that was associated with like official communism. Official communism had this image of Marx as like this godly, stern, serious, old bearded guy, right? Writing about capital from this sort of like bird's eye view of history, knowing everything, being almost, almost like a prophet. Whereas the manuscripts, also because they were manuscripts, they were not finished, so they were very fragmented, and you see that it's trying a lot of stuff out. So they feel a lot freer, and they're sort of exhilarating to read if you are largely familiar with like the more serious Marx from his later years. So, and these manuscripts were also used by sort of dissidents to the official communist movement as a way to critique like the Soviet Union politically, because the analysis of alienation is sort of, it seemed relevant to like the sort of dictatorship of the proletariat, the state's bureaucratized structures. It could be sort of expanded. So Marx was not simply about economic inequality. It's not simply about, ensuring that everybody has roughly access to the same amount of things that maybe we had done in the Soviet Union. It's also about how we want to live. It's about our self-determination. It's about our right to gain a democratic control. And it could be used quite easily to critique like the Soviet Union from that perspective. So it became very popular amongst like sort of renegades and people that have sort of fallen out of the communist movement, like philosophers, intellectuals, artists, people being more like a more bohemian type, And from this really arises this Marxism that is perhaps most associated with like anti-consumerist movement, avant-garde art, May 68, this sort of more artistic Marxism. So it had a really important importance for that movement in particular, and more generally, I would say that alienation is this really powerful concept because it has so many associ associations with it. It seems to capture something about how we relate to the world, as an experience that is really relatable for many people. I think the feeling of being isolated, of being lonely, perhaps, of lacking meaning, of lacking hope, of being disconnected. These are feelings that a lot of people have felt at some point in their lives. So if there comes like a theory that is able to explain, oh, this is a feeling that these feelings that you have is not really about you, it's not really like a psychological problem that you have as an individual. It is about how we organize society, it's about the market economy, it's about commodification and so on. It's very easy to see how such a theory could be appealing to people, particularly perhaps in that period of the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a real natural reason why this alienation theory or this concept of alienation keeps popping up. It is because it does pinpoint something that is quite central about the experience of modern life. I find that no other concepts within Marxism or outside of it really can do in the same way.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating historical context for it. Honestly, it's amazing. And also like the imagery of like that kind of orthodox, like like Soviet Karl Marx, really sort of conjured the image of some brutalist statues, with
Yeah, yeah.
the
Can
big
can I
brutalist
just add
beard and
add a small detail that is also illuminating because they were publishing when they were publishing the collected edition of Marx and Engels' works in East Germany after the war, they actually excluded the 1844 manuscripts from the works, and they instead published it in this sort of like slim separate volume, as if
oh
to say
wow.
this is not really part of the scholarship. This is something else. This is not part of our recognized. They did publish it, but not like in the series. It was on the side. And that was the only
Yeah,
work
yeah.
that was treated in that way. So it says something about how dangerous these manuscripts were perceived.
Yeah, definitely. There were a couple of comments I want to end on because they were like critical, and we haven't really gone into that side too
Mm.
much, I guess, in the conversation. They defended the capitalist production process for making like cheap consumer goods, right?
Yeah,
Everyone benefits from cheap consumer goods. So the implication seemed to be yes, we might face some psychological impact from living in a society like this, but ultimately it's a price we have to pay for having more cheap consumer goods and all of the other like advances of capitalism and mass production mostly, I guess. But like, how would you respond to that, you think?
yeah, I think that Marx would agree in a sense because alienation also fits into how he views like capitalism's role in the history of humanity, basically. And Marx's point is that capitalism constitutes a necessary prehistorical stage to the communist society precisely because capitalism is so dynamic, it's so good at producing growth, it's so good at integrating the economy together. Like before capitalism, like in more feudalism type of production, mode of production, people were generally producing like separately. They were working as peasants typically, like on their own farms, living in direct contact to the earth in a state of non-alienation, you could say, that they were in direct contact with the means of production and with their own laboring process. But what capitalism does is it really rips people up from these traditional bonds and it concentrates them in the factories, in the cities, right? And it develops this modern working class that is not rooted in any sort of tradition. or doesn't have any sort of tradition to go back to. They can't go back to being farmers again once this transition has taken place. And Marx argues that what this amounts to is a process of socialization. The mode of production becomes social. Instead of having private, isolated production, you develop this sort of global economy that everyone is working sort of together and sort of cooperating. And in a sense, that points towards communism, because the only way that we can transcend that type of economy into something better is if we take democratic control over this as a collective and institute some sort of democratically planned communist economy, right? And Marx's point is that precisely this dissolution, this initial alienation, is a necessary part. We have to be alienated so that we can be reunited, in a sense, with the production. But when we are reunited, we are not reunited as individuals, but as a collective, as a society, And this is where also the influence from Hegel shines through, I think, because in Hegel's terms as well, he also views alienation as this necessary stage in our relationship to the outer world. We start up with this sort of naive unity, then we are alienated, and when we are reunited once again, when the alienation is transcended, we are fuller, we are on a higher plan that we previously were. So the theory of alienation absolutely insists, I would say, like if you read Marx dogmatically, that we need to go through this process of alienation because it implies that we reconstitute, we can only transcend this alienation through some sort of communist economy. And that goes for the development of consumer goods as well. Like in the Grundrisse, Marx actually praises capitalism's tendency to produce consumer goods. He says that our needs are social in nature. Like initially we have these material, strictly natural needs, we have to eat, we have to feed, we have to clothe ourselves, we have to have shelter. And often we will satisfy those needs in quite simple ways. We will grow corn, or we will grow bread or potatoes, or clothe ourselves in rags just to get away from the elements. But as we evolve as a society, as our productive capacities develop, we get the opportunities the needs become more social. We can choose how we feed ourselves. I can choose the food that I like, and you can choose the food that you like. And there arises this culture around food, around clothes, around fashion, you see? And far from denouncing this as some sort of perversion or some sort of consumerist dystopia, Marx is actually really positive about this development because it says that it enhances us, it creates us as a social being. We become richer, we have more needs, we have more culture, we are more developed, we are more able to choose, we are freer in a sense. Like the development of consumer society is in some sense also a development towards freedom. It is empowering to be able to choose between 5 different brands of strawberry jam. It is. I don't see why we as Marxists should deny people that pleasure or say that, oh, you should only have one brand that shows one pair of pants. And why is that? It is good to be able to choose how to dress and what to eat and how to express your own life. There's nothing wrong with that. What is wrong with it is if it comes at the cost of this social order that we cannot really control, that we are trapped in the sort of society that is spinning out of control and that leads to all this confusion and resentment and anxiety and desperation and polarization among people. That's what's bad. But the access to consumer goods, I actually agree with the comment. That is it's nothing to. That is a positive thing that comes from capitalism, and that we should also retain. I think Marx would say, in the transition to a communist society.
Yeah, I think it's always overlooked when people first encounter any aspect of Marxism. I think the instinct always seems to be, oh, so therefore you're suggesting that we go back to feudalism, like
Yeah.
we just go back to being artisans in craft shops, and I wonder sometimes whether it's kind of like it speaks to this broader like cultural limitation we have, like the horizons of our imagination are just really limited. That
We can
when
only
we
go
see a
back, right? Yeah.
criticism, yeah, of the society we live in, we just think, oh, well, this is the best it can ever be. So if you criticize it, what do you want to do? Go backwards? I don't know why that seems to be the instinct, and not to have that more proactive, progressive kind of approach that you're describing, where, yeah, of course, you can take all of these aspects of development, keep them, but there are also areas to improve and
Mhm.
have a more optimistic view, I guess.
Yeah, and
Well,
the point is also that capitalism in its development sort of tends towards these results, given that the economy becomes more socialized. You instead of like smaller firms, you get these gigantic corporations like Amazon, I think, employs like 2 million people, and it's sort of structured as a planned economy already, right? It's like this
yeah.
giant organization that is structured top down. There's information flow, and there's a center that takes all the decisions, and in sort of way, it's sort of almost like a communist country already. So I think that Marx's point is that capitalism, because it tends to socialize the productive forces, at one point it becomes impossible to continue this road of socialization while still retaining the idea that, oh, there should only be like one individual or one small group of individuals calling all the shots. It calls for like a democratic organization of the economy, like naturally as a natural outgrowth of the path that it's already tending towards.
Yeah, but there are some interesting debates around that, aren't there? I think like the point you make about Amazon, etc. You know, that I can't remember the authors now, but the People's Republic of Walmart. I remember
Hmm.
skipping through that at one point, and you've got discussions around, fully automated luxury communism and things like this. So I guess that, there are still elements of utopianism within that thinking. But Emil, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks so much for taking the time, and yeah, it'd be great to talk again one day.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.